Hello. For my project, I'm going to be doing a summary of 2 interviews from Tony Keith Jr. on about his book, How the Boogeyman Became a Poet. Both of these interviews are on YouTube, and I'll start with the first one. It's an interview from Vegas film critic, and the interviewer is Jeffrey Howard. He starts by asking him what are his challenges and emotions while going through the writing of the book. And Tony mentions vulnerability and freedom, being two in particular, that he was glad to have gotten it out of his system, the story, keeping all of these emotions bottled up, and it was a good way to express them, this book. He then asks him how he got into poetry, and Tony answers, poetry found him in third grade in a poetry contest. He won the contest, and his teacher loved his poem so much that she pinned it in the class, and it stayed there all year. So it meant a lot to him growing up. And that he would write poetry to himself in his teen years. That's when he began to do it for himself. The interviewer then asks him why write for young adults, and Tony says he wants to give them a fun read. Felt his story mattered, and also wanted adults to be able to relate to. It's for both young adults and adults. A quote he used that stood out to me was a story written in a cool way, or that he wants a story written in a cool way on a page for all kinds of learners and readers. So he wanted everybody to be included. And then he asks him about the boogeyman, where does that come from? And then Tony explains it comes from a phone call he had with a friend. It was a somber phone call. So after it, his heart feels heavy, he says, and he expresses himself with poetry and ends it with, and so the boogeyman became a poet. And, that line stood out to him a lot, so much so that he used it for the book and, keeps that poem that he wrote for his friend in the epilogue of the book. He also mentions that he treats his book writing like an academic essay in a way, where he has a question that he's essentially looking for the answer to this entire time, and the question being why are you afraid of who you are, and how did you become unafraid of who you are? And that explains, the photocopied poems as evidence and proof, in a way. Then mentions, the interviewer asks him, if your story reaches one person, will it matter? And Tony goes, absolutely. My story and hardships matter, and that it's worth it if it reaches one person. Absolutely. That everybody has their own boogie people, and that people should know that, and be educated about that, so you can address it. Second interview is from the Headliner Chicago podcast, and this one, the interviewer does not name himself, kind of just goes straight into it, talking about Tony's therapist and how she inspired him. And Tony laughs and talks about how, yes, the therapist suggested that he goes and rereads his poems he's collected throughout the years, and Tony does, and sees the value in it by expressing his emotions. He cries a lot, he says, and it was almost ritualistic in a way, just freeing himself from, these poems, kind of, and these emotions that he's had pent up. He also mentions that he felt, as a kid, he felt alien and not complete, and that after reading these poems, it affirmed, it was a word, he emphasized that it affirmed that he was whole and complete the whole time, and that everything worked out. He grew up to be a poet, and it's okay. Interviewer asked him about the parts of the book, and Tony breaks down the parts, going from first generation, broke, college student, and at the same time being a gay black man in the early 2000s, late 90s, and the stigma that goes along with that, and finding his own, and then going to finding his own voice and the power in that, and the power he has in expressing himself through poetry. Yeah. And then the interviewer asks him about being a gay black man, did you have an idol growing up, like someone to relate to, a story or anything? And Tony says no, he didn't, and that meant a lot to him, not having that, like, you know, idol or figure to look up to, or story, even anything to relate to. That he struggled with that, and that he especially wanted his book to, you know, be something for the youth today that are in positions that he was in. He wants them to know that they're not alone, and, you know, he wants them to have what he didn't. So I thought that was really cool. He wants his book to be about discovery. He mentions that he didn't, you know, since he had nobody like that, he used the internet and people online as a community and research database. And then, you know, wraps the interview up with reiterating these boogie people that everybody has and has to deal with. And, you know, how will you discover those boogie people, and how will you discover your solution to that in your medium? You know, his was poetry. So he just wants people to be aware of that and be able to deal with them healthy, essentially. So it was really nice watching these interviews and getting this information from him himself while reading. So yeah, and here is my works cited. So thank you.